Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kick them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died.
Hello and good evening, everybody. It's a Monday night. It's Monday the 11th of September, and in honor of that, of course, we will be, as previously advertised, making the subject of tonight's program a discussion of the events of the 11th of September 1973, which was, of course, the day in which the Chilean military, led by the contemptible and, quite frankly, ludicrous figure of Augusto Pinochet, though, of course, it takes a ludicrous figure to do these things sometimes. A man who was, the entirety of his life, a compliant puppet and stooge of US imperialism, and, of course, his dear friends in British imperialism, which, of course, included such luminaries as Margaret Thatcher. He, of course, chose to act to restore the domination of US imperialism over Chile. And this was, of course, something that was cooked up not just in the halls of the Chilean ruling class, but with their masters in Washington, D.C. And Augusto Pinochet and others was, of course, their obedient dog in carrying out these orders. And that's how we should always view these fascist and ultra-reactionary leaders who come to power, blabbering on and screaming about nationhood and everything else that they like to go on about, when in actual fact they are, as I've said before, a truly anti-national breed. Because what they, of course, intend to do, for all the words about nationhood, it is essentially a purist and most violent version of the expression of the class interests of the bourgeoisie. And in this case, the class interests of the Chilean bourgeoisie dictated that they restore their nation into a position of complete subservience at the feet of US imperialism. And that is what, of course, General Augusto Pinochet dutifully did for the 17 years during which his dictatorship lasted. It was a continual process of prostration, of destruction of the national sovereignty of Chile, of the people of Chile, in order to preserve the profits of the tiny minority, the Chilean ruling class, and of course their true masters in Washington, D.C. And so that is why we must always have nothing but contempt for the fascists and all of their words about national pride and national restoration, defending the nation against external influences, by which they mean, of course, communism, when the ultimate and most perfidious external influence is, of course, always U.S. imperialism. It is U.S. imperialism which has been the most violent force on earth since the end of World War II. And it's the most violent force on earth to this day because, of course, it seeks to maintain the hold of itself and its ruling class as the tiniest of minorities, as the ultimate beneficiary of a global system. They used to call it the free world or the first world. Now they call it the rules-based international order. And it is always held down with the most extreme and reactionary violence. And this was, of course, exemplified many times after World War II. But to recall some examples which might, of course, be familiar to you, we've already discussed on previous weeks the example of the coming to power of General Suharto in 1965 in Indonesia, and the overthrow of Sukarno and the murder of, well, depending upon which figures you choose to look at, anywhere between 600,000 to 1.5 million Indonesians, the annihilation of the largest communist party outside of the Soviet state, and of course the wider socialist bloc. And of course we have then, following on from what happened in Chile in 1973, the long period of Operation Condor, which is the CIA-run operation that was designed specifically along the lines of the lessons that were drawn by people like Reinhard Gehlen of the Nazi intelligence services from World War II, which is how to break up and destroy working class power, how to break up and destroy communist parties, socialist parties, etc., how to use targeted violence and extreme violence to deliver the most efficient result, which is the destruction of the revolutionary working class forces and the beheading, quite literal beheading, of its leaders. Thousands upon thousands dead, missing forever, never returned across all of Central and South America in a war that was really unending. Operation Condor never truly ended. And it is this, of course, the most extreme manifestations of the violence imposed by US imperialism, to which we will be turning to tonight. But I would be remiss in my duty as host of this program if I were to not mention our most recurring subject, our subject to which we return over and over again, because it is, of course, the prism through which all global events can now be seen more clearly if you have the right lens applied and understood. And that is, of course, the war in Ukraine. Because there are many similarities with the Pinochet regime and the regime that was imposed by US imperialism and its local puppets in Kiev in 2014. It was brought in to do many of the same things, crush the final resistance of the Ukrainian working class and orchestrate the looting of every single piece of the assets of the state that had been handed over to the Ukrainian state following the breakup of the Soviet Union, the annihilation of working class resistance, the breaking up of any working class organization that stood in the way of the complete and utter fire sale of Ukrainian assets, and of course the turning of the nation into nothing but an outsourced military force that was designed to be used as a weapon against the Russian Federation in the 30-year-long campaign waged by US imperialism of destruction and destabilization against the Russian state. And this, of course, has certain comparisons with the Chilean regime of Augusto Pinochet, principally in the character of the sort of people that it elevates to power. Because, of course, US imperialism in Kiev in 2014 was seeking to empower a tiny minority, because it was only a minority that wanted NATO membership, that wanted integration in what they laughably call the Euro-Atlantic system. And the reality behind all those desires was, of course, the desire of in this case, the Ukrainian ruling class to loot and pilfer non-stop and without the restrictions that they previously had imposed upon them by the still powerful resistance of the Ukrainian working class. And it is to this end that they turned to a fascist coup, sponsored, of course, by US imperialism. And in order to get their way, of course, this tiny minority had to use the most extreme violence to break up those areas of the population, those groups in the population that would provide the most resistance. And so just as Augusto Pinochet did most of the killings that are associated with his reign in the first few months of his rule, as he sought to effectively and quite literally behead the communists, the socialists, anybody who might pose any degree of resistance to the reign of his US puppet regime. The same is true of the Kiev regime that was brought in 2014. The only thing is, of course, that the working class of what was then Eastern Ukraine, now Western Russia, was able to wage a more effective armed resistance than the Chilean working class were able to do. They were able to draw upon the long traditions of their very strong working class organization and armed resistance against fascism, going back all the way to the Great Patriotic War, and of course their ability to split the state forces of Ukraine, which of course wasn't available to the Chileans, but they were able to, of course, wage an effective anti-fascist resistance for 8 long years before, under extreme pressure, the Russian state finally acted. And so I want to draw this introduction to a conclusion by mentioning something that I'm going to be returning to tomorrow. You see, when I was growing up and when I was first coming into political activism in the early 2000s, the case of Chile was still talked about in angry terms or in reverent terms, depending upon whether you were talking about the coup or whether you were talking about Allende. And it was, of course, just after the time when there was that brief attempt by a Spanish judge to secure Pinochet for trial, leading to his brief detention in Britain and an absolute horrendous outpouring of sympathy for him from the ruling class in Britain, which, of course, why wouldn't they be sympathetic with him? He was doing their bidding after all. He was a very good customer of British imperialism, a very good regional manager for US imperialism. And so when I came into the movement for the first time in the early 2000s, the movement, as it is laughably referred to today, barely exists. The case of Chile was talked about a lot, as was the case of the support of the British working class, the Spanish Republican movement, support for anti-fascist struggles. Now, in the way that we've talked about before, all of these things can be turned by imperialism into their opposite. So you get the heroic struggles against Pinochet, you get the heroic struggles of the British working class against fascism back in the 30s, turned and distorted by the servants of the imperialists, the social imperialists in the British trade union movement, the social chauvinists, the Trotskyites, the opportunistic bureaucrats, the cowardly left reformists who, under the pressure of imperialism, have now twisted and distorted all of this into a declaration of support for the Kiev regime and for perpetual war against the Russian Federation. That is, of course, what they will attempt to pass through the Trades Union Congress tomorrow. And so you can see that the complete degeneration of the leadership of the British working class is almost complete. If they pass this tomorrow, then it will be a disgrace, a moment that will live on, and the stench from which will be discernible to the nostrils of many generations to come. But I will cover this properly tomorrow when we know the result, either yay or nay, from the stinking nest of corruption that is the TUC annual conference. But on with our business for today, which is, of course, the discussion of September the 11th, 1973. And perhaps, if the audience wants to, we can touch upon the relevance of another date that is, of course, more recent to us, which is September the 11th, 2001, and how things might be linked between the two famous 9/11s or infamous 9/11s. Right, time to pause and say hello to who is in the chat. Hello to Banana Bender, who is rereading Capital Volume 1. Well, set some time aside for that one. Good evening to Red Star Betty. And good evening, or good afternoon to Lavitz. Good evening to Jay. Good afternoon to Mike Martinez. Evening to Roddy. And hello to my comrade Peter, who is with us from Perfidious Albion. And good evening to Heidi, Morgan, Klavek, Frank Koletsko, who correctly identifies Ewan McCall on the Ballad of Stalin as our introductory music. Hello to Alan out there in Oakland. Hello to President Jesus all the way from Los Angeles. My sympathies at being in the den of inequity ruled by Gavin American Psycho Newsom. Maybe, soon to be President Newsom. And how horrifying is all that. Good evening to Burke. And good evening to Irish Partisan, our comrade in Minsk. Hello to Michael Hodgson over there in the tyranny of Trudeau in Canada. Hello to Movie Maker Joe. Greetings to Philbin. Good morning to Ash down there in Melbourne. And Irish Partisan says the statement from the NUM was nauseating. Yes, and as my comrade Jyoti has pointed out, how miserable a fate the National Union of Mine Workers has suffered. Has about 80-odd members now, and is just used to move pro-fascist motions through the TUC. It's the British ruling class truly has its revenge by making you a servant of themselves. And Bernardo Bender says roughly 5% of the world's liquefied natural gas supply is being held hostage by Chevron workers in northwest WA. Can you specify what WA means? Is it Wyoming? I'm not sure. They are doing stoppages and will increase to 24 hours this week. Well, thanks for telling me. I will make sure we publicise that. Apologies, I've already mentioned, asks Philbin. Any substantive link between Allende and modern Chilean socialism to Marmaduke Grove's brief 3-month Chilean Socialist Republic of 1932? Left junta seized power for 3 months. Interesting. I'm sure that there's a historical link, just the same way there was a historical link between the brief Spanish Republic in the 19th century and then the more extensive one later on in the 1930s. Revolutionary hotbed of Bournemouth, Mallard. Well, I may even have some connections down there myself. Burke asks, how could Allende have done better? Oh, and WA is Western Australia. Okay. Well, I'll look that up. Thanks for the heads up. So, hello to Shikamaru233. And right, okay. So, discussing, of course, first of all, the 9/11 of 1973. And for those of you who, of course, aren't aware, the 3-year presidency of Salvador Allende, a man who was heavily influenced by Marxism, but of course not a revolutionary, and he's coming to power with what was known as the Popular Unity Coalition, marks a huge turning point in the development of the class struggle in South America, I would say, in particular. And it is something which, even though it was extirpated with great violence by the Chilean state forces, is something from which many other examples have learnt, or at least the most successful of them have learnt, mainly the Sandinista struggle in Nicaragua and, of course, the Bolivarian revolutionary process that is ongoing today in Venezuela. And there is, of course, much to learn in terms of it being a cautionary tale. Now, to give this a shorthand, of course, Allende had been, I believe originally he was a medical doctor, but had been an opposition politician for many, many years. Chile, and this is relevant to the discussion of the nature of popular unity and the nature of Allende's approach had, of course, been a bourgeois democracy for a long period of time. It had avoided military rule in a way that, of course, the rest of the Southern American republics that had all become independent from Spanish and Portuguese imperialism had all succumbed to in the 20th century. And it, of course, had a long-established constitution. And this, perhaps, was part of the reason why Allende's belief that he could negotiate his way through this constitution and proceed according to bourgeois democratic norms, and that this would be something which was possible in terms of a process of socialist transformation. And in his victory speech of September 5th, 1970, he does make it fairly clear, in complete fairness to him, that he now sees the working class as being in charge of society through his presidency. And, of course, he was leading a coalition with strong support from the Chilean Communist Party and others, and he had a very ambitious program of change, including, of course, the planning system based on revolutionary applications of computer technology, which we will be coming back to when I've researched it properly. But you read through the program he presented to the Chilean Parliament in 1970, it's clear that he has a process of socialist construction in mind. It is the fact that, very much the case, that he is not just doing one or two reforms, that he does have in mind a comprehensive transformation of Chilean society. Now, of course, the problem with this is, and this is what Enver Hoxha pointed out in his response to the 1973 coup, was that, of course, the reactionary forces are not just going to sit idle. And here we get into a discussion of constitutionalism, because this is very relevant both to the trends that developed in the 1970s that grew out of Khrushchevite revisionism and are still with us, unfortunately, to this day, and their response to the 1973 coup. Allende's approach to trying to implement this program was that he tried to, of course, work through the Chilean bourgeois democratic process and Chilean constitution. What this reveals, of course, the response of the ruling class, was, well, just how ruling classes actually view constitutions, actually view things like the separation of powers, the civilian control over the military, a free and open press, freedom of workers to organize, all of which have been proclaimed loudly by various bourgeois politicians after World War II, how little that all means when it actually comes down to a real and coherent threat to bourgeois interests. Because make no mistake, if you read the program that Allende ran on and the program he presented to the Chilean parliament in 1970, it is clear that he has in mind and wants to proceed with a socialist transformation of society. And if you're the Chilean ruling class, the big landowners, the owners of the monopolies, and even more so if you are their ultimate masters on Wall Street and in Washington, then you are going to see that correctly as a dire threat to your interests. And you are going to use every means possible, fair or foul, mostly foul, it must be said, to try and subvert this, undermine it, derail it. And if you ultimately can't do it by just intimidation and causing the economy to collapse, or as Kissinger said, make the economy scream, then ultimately you pull the trigger on the big one, which is the coup itself. And what you see from the very earliest period when popular unity comes to power is, of course, that the Chilean ruling class are from the earliest period under instruction from Nixon, Kissinger and others, Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, all acting, of course, in the interests of US imperialism and making sure that, to quote Kissinger, you don't let a country go communist just because its people have been stupid enough to vote the wrong way. And Kissinger is, in his more honest moments, at least a blunt presence in the story, and will clearly articulate the wishes of the US ruling class in a way that isn't bogged down in phony morality and hypocrisy. He'll just state that we're doing this because it's in our interest to do it. And herein lies the problem. And because not only did Allende think he could proceed through the established constitutional and democratic channels, he hoped that he could, of course, persuade the army to remain politically neutral. It is true, as Philbin points out in the comments, that he lost an ally in the former head of the General Staff, and Rene Schneider, who was apparently, if my reading on this is correct, was murdered by the CIA. That was one of the stories that came out later on. And, of course, replaced by Pinochet. In the same way that later on in the decade, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, a different character entirely, but also something of a reformist in Pakistan, was, for some reason, deciding to appoint Zia-ul-Haq, the man who would overthrow and kill him, as the chief of the Pakistani General Staff. So the question over the neutrality of the military and the ability of the revolution to defend itself brings itself up. This question needs to be answered. So did Allende, to draw on Philbin's question, stand any chance of actually going forward with his program? Well, there is a chance, but of course not if you rely on the state forces. The truth is that you cannot rely on these state forces to remain neutral, and the only chance you've got of making any progress with your program, barring the overthrow of the existing state and its state machine, and the reconstitution of new forces of repression under the command of a proletarian dictatorship, then you have the only other road you have open to you is the road that, of course, was shown to the world by Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian revolutionary process, which, as Pablo points out in the comments, you can't rely on the bourgeois state. The bourgeois state, the permanent bureaucracy, the army, these are all dominated by the direct representatives of the Chilean ruling class. These are always institutions, whether it's in South America or whether it's in an imperialist country like Britain, especially if it's an imperialist country like Britain. These are always ultra-reactionary institutions, and here we must, of course, return to the timeless lessons provided to us by Lenin. The army is always deliberately created to be an ultra-reactionary institution. It, of course, relies in every country upon recruits from the working class or the peasantry or both, but its officer corps is, of course, always taken from the bourgeoisie or the landowners or both, and a atmosphere of subservience and complete reaction always reigns within it, because of course that is what the ruling class need, and they are the ones setting the culture within such an army. And of course an army, particularly one that is unified and its officer corps is very professional, and of course it's heavily influenced by US imperialism, is one that is going to be an incredibly powerful tool of reaction. Even the soldiers that come from working class backgrounds are going to have more loyalty to their officers and NCOs than they are to their class. And you see this in the British Army, which were a unit of which was using that Jeremy Corbyn's picture for target practice. This is an arm. These are the ranks of the army are deliberately depoliticized. They are deliberately flooded with the most ultra-reactionary elements of bourgeois ideology that is deliberately promoted within them. And of course, they're bound together often by the crimes that they've committed in the name of imperialism, and have every reason to fear a government that might bring some of these to light or start asking questions about things that they've done. So armies are always a basis of reaction. Now, of course, that shouldn't mean that, to draw upon the word of Lenin, that we shouldn't try and find some way to organize around the state's special bodies of armed men. but you have to be aware of what your starting point is. And the starting point is that this is a force which is going to be hostile to you. And no amount of persuasion, or as Allende tried to do, appeals to the Constitution, or mobilizing moral pressure through the mass mobilization of supporters of yourself, no amount of that is going to actually have much of an impact on these hardcore reactionary fascist figures such as Pinochet and others. You don't get to them by appeals to morality or legality, because, as I've said, the bourgeoisie will torch all of their institutions, all of the constitutional norms and legalities that they say they value so much, if their class interests take them in that direction. I mean, just look at what they did recently, even to figures that are reactionaries themselves, such as in our country, Liz Truss, of all people. They managed to get rid of her in a manufactured coup. Now, there was no army involvement in that, but they essentially went around the unwritten constitution of Britain to essentially stage a parliamentary party coup against a sitting prime minister in a way that wasn't in line with any constitutional norms at all. They just made them up as they go along. Same is true in the United States with Trump, where they're trying to put him on trial, violating all kind of constitutional norms and legal norms in doing so, even according to very middle-of-the-road legal scholars. And they do that because in this situation of decaying and rotting capitalism, the system's becoming more and more unstable. It can't tolerate anybody who's not just a complete cipher and under the control of the state bureaucracy. Even a Trump or a Truss is too much for them. And think of this and go back in time 50 years ago to the desperate struggles that were going on all the way across the world. And you get an idea of the sheer hysteria and foaming at the mouth rage that the anti-communist bourgeois military officers would have felt, along with, of course, the entirety of the Chilean state bureaucracy, certainly its hierarchy, the organization of the police forces in Chile. All of these are bourgeois institutions designed to protect bourgeois property, fundamentally. Never mind the law, it's bourgeois property and the rule of the bourgeois that they are ultimately protecting. And so what can you do? Well, again, like Castro, when he met with Allende, advised him to build his own forces to protect his revolution against what happened to him, to arm and mobilize the workers in an organized fashion. Allende, of course, refused to do that. He believed that he could still pilot his way through constitutional means. He was also afraid of sparking a civil war. Now, Allende, of course, was no coward. He was sincerely dedicated to this version of a revolutionary process that he had outlined in his program. However, by refusing to draw on Hoxha's words, to counter reactionary violence with revolutionary violence, he condemned thousands of his strongest supporters to an instantaneous and, in some case, grisly and drawn-out death. Now, he himself died in either via the shots fired by the reactionary army units that besieged the presidential palace after his 40-strong presidential guard fought to the death to try and defend him. So he did not flee. He did not try to escape elsewhere or go into exile. He paid the ultimate price for his own failings. But they are failings, ultimately. If you're not going to do anything to protect against a reaction that you know is coming, they were organizing against him out in the open. I mean, if you look back at the amount of provocations they engaged in, the multiple terrorist actions, the fascist mobs that were running amok, attacking workers' organizations, attacking factories, attacking even government ministers, with the connivance of the Chilean police services, military and intelligence services. They weren't hiding, really, anything that they were doing. Yes, Pinochet was some sort of Uriah Heep figure, sort of simpering and groveling one minute and plotting the next, but the moves that the reactionaries were making were very obvious and out in the open. The civil war that Allende wanted to prevent was already upon him. whether he would have it or not. It's already there. And this is thankfully a lesson that was learnt, because this is a lesson that was forced by Allende's failure and the collapse of popular unity, and it's the murderous reign of Pinochet. It was a lesson that was learned after the attempted overthrow of Chavez in 2002, of course, when he was saved due to the fact that he was an old military man. He had a certain following in the army, so there was a split there, but it was the mass mobilization and preparedness to actually fight on behalf of the Venezuelan workers and peasants that terrified the ruling class into backing off. And that's the only way you can deal with these people. If you're not in a position where you are going to lead the workers to smash the old bourgeois state and build the dictatorship of the proletariat, if you are going to try and go through this elongated process, then you can't just go through the channels of the bourgeois state. You need to build your own centers of power. And whereas, of course, some factories in Chile passed under workers' control and there was nationalizations were carried out, Allende's process didn't go anywhere near as far as the Bolivarian Revolution in Chile or the examples of the last 20 years in Nicaragua, for instance, of building workers' power, building counter centers of power to the bourgeois state in the form of the mass mobilization of the working class through the popular assemblies, in Venezuela, which of course went along with the Chavez and then Maduro following Castro's very sound advice of forming a mass armed forces of the working class and then purging the military right along with that, getting rid of all the disloyal generals and being able to do so more securely because you have an armed force of your own that you are building alongside this. And the masses have already proved that they are willing to go out there and risk their lives and fight to preserve you in power, you, i.e. Chavez, because you are the representative of their revolutionary process. It is only the power of the masses and only the organized power of the masses that can possibly hope to oppose these reactionary forces, such as Pinochet and the Chilean military hierarchy. And let's be clear, again, going back to Lenin's example and then Hoxha's writing about 1973, reactionary violence can only be met by revolutionary violence. If the reactionaries are going to be out in the open committing acts of horrendous violence against your supporters, against the organized working class, then it is incumbent upon the revolutionaries and incumbent that they demand of the leadership that a revolutionary response be put in place. And that includes, ultimately, the violent repression of those who oppose the revolution in the manner, of course, done by the Red Army, done by the early Cheka, headed by Felix Dzerzhinsky. And, of course, the reactionaries and their international supporters of imperialism will scream and howl and gibber about human rights abuses, abuse of democracy. Why is this horrendous socialist doing this to us? But, of course, you have to have a very, very hard head and clearly explain, and of course the masses will understand, if it is their revolution that you're fighting for, that this repression of their enemies is something which is necessary. And again, you have to at least have the potential to do that. And of course, at least in Venezuela, the potential to do that does exist, which of course helps to keep the comprador bourgeoisie at least checked in terms of their power and their ability to do anything. At least the building in Venezuela of the Constituent Assembly, in comparison to the National Assembly, which is headed by a certain Mr. Juan Guaido, remember him, and the mobilization of and the arming of the masses was a counter to the power of the comprador bourgeoisie and the still existing elements of the old bourgeois state. Whereas, of course, popular unity didn't have much of that. There was armed resistance against the coup. There was intense fighting for a month or so afterwards. But the Chilean operation, run, of course, by the CIA, was very efficient in literally, as I said before, beheading popular unity. The first people that they sought to kill were the working class leaders in Chile. It was them, the radical working class leaders, the worker communists, the militant trade unionists, those who could potentially and most effectively organize mass resistance against the coup. They were the ones who were the first to die. Before people even got dragged off to the football stadiums, these people were crowded into the basements of police stations and executed en masse because the reactionaries weren't messing around. They knew who their enemies were. It was the worker communists who were their most dangerous enemy, and it is them who they killed first, as they always kill first. Right, I'll pause now for some more questions and comments in the discussion. Right. Good evening to Zuleika. President Jesus says Allende should have learned from Arbenz. Indeed. It's funny, Che Guevara certainly learned from Arbenz. And Che, I think, drew more of the correct lessons than Allende, even though his revolutionary warfare in Bolivia did end in failure. Bernardo Bender says, execute the fascists in the army before they're used against the people. That's simple. It is that simple. However, the only caveat I put on that is that the process always needs to mobilize the masses and take the masses with you, so that every move is endorsed, embraced, and understood. If it's done that way and the masses understand who their enemies are, they'll have no problem seeing some reactionary general swing for it. The Ash says the state has unlinked police from their communities by bringing them from different areas and moving them around, or they bring in specialized forces to break up dissent. How do they do this with the army? Well, the thing is, they've actually weakened the army in Britain because it's a lot smaller. I mean, now the army could barely fill a football stadium in Britain. I think it's only around 80,000 strong, and only around 20,000 of those are actual fighting soldiers. So whereas 50 years ago, you'd have had to face an army around about at least 250,000 strong if they could mobilize them all, and a considerable reserve, you don't have to face that anymore. Yes, 20,000 men or 80,000 men is still nothing to be sniffed at, but they've weakened themselves considerably. I think that you can see the British bourgeois will need to expand their military pretty soon if they're going to carry out the level of internal repression that they'll be wanting to. But they've weakened that. Now, the police have also been weakened because there's a lot less of them. There's an awful lot less of them than there was 40 years ago. And the population is a lot bigger and a lot more proletarianized now. In many ways, the bourgeoisie, through their arrogance and complacency, have done a lot of our work in Britain for us. I think the same is true in some other nations as well. I know, though, that the state of play in the United States is still very much one where the numbers of law enforcement are still huge in many different areas. The level of militarization of the police force is much, much higher. So in Britain, though, they've done a lot of the work for us by we're having a disarmed police force, a very small military. But, of course, the reason why they can get away with that is because, of course, the working class is so weak. If you started to see the working class make serious moves, the ruling class would suddenly find an awful lot of money to fund its repressive apparatus through. Mallard says, in Britain, the police and the parliament still take their oaths to the crown. Yes, the police and the army, all the repressive organisations of the state in Britain take their oath of loyalty to the monarch. Now, that's important because they can constitutionally act against an elected government in the House of Commons and remove it on the orders of the monarch. Now, of course, as I said before, legality can be thrown away when it suits them, but sometimes they like a fig leaf to cover them. And in this case, that fig leaf is provided by the oath of loyalty not being to any sitting government or prime minister, it's to the monarch. And that's why Marxist scholars on the Constitution of Britain, or the lack of one, have called the monarchy a reserved tool of reaction. That's what it is. It's a tool of last resort. If you can't get rid of the government any other way, then a bunch of army officers do it in the name of the king. And if you don't believe they'd do it, they tried to do it in the late 1960s. There was a conspiracy, first of all, led by a lunatic newspaper baron by the name of Cecil Harmsworth King, which is documented by the great Australian journalist John Pilger in his book Hidden Agendas from the early 2000s, one of the first political books I ever read. And in that he outlines the plot by Harmsworth King, which of course was a lot more serious than it first appeared, because it involved, of course, pillar of the establishment and, of course, disgusting degenerate Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was, of course, later revealed to be a serial rapist of children, and was later deservedly taken out by the IRA. But we'll get into that in another episode. But the Mountbatten coup, or the attempted coup, was something that was talked about for a long time in the early 1970s, when, of course, why was it talked about in Britain? It was talked about because working class militancy was at its height. And so the ruling class were, or the more extreme end of them, were looking for a way to smash working class organizations. The more sensible members of the ruling class realized that if they tried to do that, it would escalate the situation to near revolutionary terms, and they weren't confident in their ability to pull that off. So what they did was, of course, they turned to a much more effective solution for destroying working class militancy at the time, and that is, of course, the Labour Party, of whom more tomorrow. So, Pablo says, similar to Spain, they moved Franco to the Canary Islands rather than sacking him. Exactly right. Spain's another one where the military were openly plotting the demise of the Republican government. The Spanish communists, who were a very, very small force at the time, were telling the Republican leaders and the leaders of the PSOE, Spanish Socialist Party, people like Largo Caballero, one of their leaders, telling them over and over and over again, look, they're going to try and coup you out, in the way that the Spanish military had done on many occasions in a move known as the pronunciamiento. And they'd done this on so many occasions. It was very well established in Spanish political life that this is what the military did to governments it didn't like. And yet the Republican government remained paralyzed, terrified. And of course, you have to ask the question why. It's because in the Spanish case, much like Popular Unity 35 years later in Chile, these, even the more sincere of them, were men of reformist points of view. They thought that they could navigate their way through bourgeois democratic means, maybe by mobilizing the masses every now and again to morally compel the Spanish ruling class to back down. But when you're dealing with a frenzied and reactionary ruling class that sees its privileges under threat, of course, they're not going to stop because, you've had a demonstration, or that you've had an election, or that you've got a stronger majority in parliament. In their view, they are the nation. The bourgeoisie views itself completely as the nation. They are the nation. Anybody who is, of course, threatening their interests is therefore threatening the nation. They view themselves still as the universal subject, as the sole political agent, as the sole agents that are capable of and legitimately hold political power. And anything outside of that is a horrible imposition and must be fought to the death. And that's why, of course, they scream and babble every time that their interests are threatened, because it is an essential to that class's understanding of itself that it is the only political subject. It is the only political agent, the only legitimate political agent. And that's how, really, we need to be encouraging workers to think. We need to be adopting some of that mentality that the bourgeoisie obtained through, of course, the long period of bourgeois revolutions. We need to be taking that on. And here I'll come, of course, to, in a moment, just to some of these questions regarding the conclusions drawn by the revisionists and why they're so wrong. Okay. Philbin says, the brazenness of the fascists is what some do not grasp, and Allende himself, maybe fatally, did not understand. It was a less a noble, close-run fight than a fascist predator toying with its prey and waiting. Yes, the fight came at the end and it was only brief. However, it could have been prevented with action taken sooner. But yes, Philbin is right. Good evening to my comrade Beju out there in Barnet. Also, Andy made the mistake of not taking control of the media. Yeah, well, Ash's point is completely correct. This is the other big thing: commitment to free media, and this is a thing that was screamed about in Venezuela as well. It's like, well, the bourgeoisie don't give platforms to their enemies, or they will give you a platform as long as they are convinced that no one's paying any attention to you. If people are paying attention to you en masse, then you get your platform closed down, or they throw you in prison, like they have done with Julian Assange. That's what they do. That's what they think of free speech. And you can scream and shout and jump up and down about free speech all day and all night. But again, they see free speech as something which belongs to them and is only of use to them as long as it serves their class. The problem with all this, largely American, but not exclusively, it's a very petty bourgeois view of free speech, is that there is no such thing as a hard and fast free speech principle. It's all related to class. The bourgeoisie will value free speech for themselves at certain points, as long as it benefits them, and that's why they came up with the idea in the first place. It's why it became a principle of the Enlightenment. It was because they wanted the freedom to criticize in Britain and in France and in the United States the old semi-feudal forms of rule, and they didn't want to be thrown in prison for criticizing the king, and they didn't want to be thrown in prison for criticizing the king's taxes. And that is, of course, why freedom of speech became a bourgeois principle. We, as communists, fight for freedom of speech because we fight for the ability to express our ideas openly and to properly reach the proletariat with them. That's why we fight for it. We fight for it because it is a thing that could be valuable in terms of us being able to reach the proletariat and the proletariat being able to access communist ideas. That's why we fight for it. That's why the bourgeoisie fights for it in terms of getting its class interests served. We must fight for it in terms of getting our class interests served. And it is not in the interests of our class to allow the propaganda of the enemy to remain. And therefore, when you're in a situation where the class war has broken out into the open, and they are openly calling for a armed rebellion against you, and stirring up acts of terrorism and commending acts of terrorism, then newspapers, television stations, radio stations that do that must be treated in the same way the bourgeois would do with regard to their enemies. If we were to do things like that, they would, and we got a mass audience, they would close us down. If they do things like that, then if you're in a position to mobilize the masses and close them down, then that's exactly what you should do. And let them howl and scream about free speech. And again, as long as you take the masses with you in this process and clearly explain what this is and what is going on, then the masses will go with you. Because a lot of these newspapers, whether it's in Chile or Britain or the United States or Australia, they might be read about or casually skimmed over, but once their role is clearly explained, the masses will follow you in properly identifying these as organs of the enemy, as they should be treated. Burke says, will the Bolivarian Revolution survive long without a revolutionary dictatorship? Well, it survived for 20 years. Its prospects are better now, I would say, than they were 5 years ago, given the weakening of American imperialism. But I do have a worry that, of course, the American imperialists are going to make another big play to take, or try to take, more full control over Southern and Central America again, and that would, of course, include Venezuela. They haven't given up on that. Now, they've received a setback because, of course, Gustavo Petro got in Colombia, and Lula got back in Brazil, and those were two big centers of reaction that the US relied upon to carry out shady stuff in Venezuela. So they've received setbacks, but as their actions in Peru and getting rid of Castillo and getting their forces back in there again have shown, they've still got the ability to cause a lot of problems. So in the end, what is going to, of course, need to happen in Venezuela is that the revolutionary process is going to need to be completed, which is that the bourgeoisie is going to need to be expropriated, both economically and politically. Now, when that happens and how it happens is, of course, something that the Venezuelan masses themselves will decide. But it must happen at some point. Now, so far they've managed to check the power of the compradors and the power of the reactionaries. However, that is a process which will be a constant push-pull. And again, as I say, eventually that process will have to be brought to a conclusion. And I hope that that's a conclusion that is going to be, of course, in favour of the great masses of Venezuela, who have fought very long and very hard to get this far. So, Bernardo Bender says, Costa Rica supposedly doesn't even have an army or military, or at least a tiny one, yet socialists and communists there are non-existent. Yeah, I think that the Costa Rica question is quite interesting, and I only know that they moved a constitutional amendment to get rid of the professional army some time ago, but it's remained a country that's been pretty solidly in the camp of imperialism ever since then. So it's an interesting question. You know what? I'm going to have to take it away and return to it at some point, because I don't know enough about it to actually answer on it now. Ash says, the mass murders were horrifying enough, but the stories of torture inspire nightmares. Peaceful revolution is a myth. The ruling class will be violent and we need to respond. And Ash is absolutely correct. Like, if you read, like, the way in which those, like, the fascists in Chile operated, like, I won't even repeat the shit that they did, but, like, it's, like, blood-curdling stuff. I mean, there's the famous example of, like, you know, chucking people out of helicopters, but that's comparatively mild compared to what else they did. Not just in Chile, but all of Operation Condor. Again, all run by the CIA, with their stooges in Argentina and Chile and elsewhere in Brazil, all designed to annihilate anybody who could possibly pose a threat to US imperialist control, and all of which was originally designed or based upon the ideas of the Nazis. Because, of course, the US took over the role from the Nazis as the center of world reaction. It does it in different ways. It's not, you know, flying a swastika, but the center of world imperialist reaction necessitates extremely violent methods to maintain itself. And when you're trying to maintain control of the large areas of the world to the ultimate benefit of less than 1% of the world's population, less than 1% of 1%, in fact, then that you can only really do that via, of course, mass propaganda, cultural influencing, all plays its role. But when it comes down to it, it's all down to the imposition of violence by the bourgeois dictatorship. And that is why, to draw upon Ash's point, we shouldn't be selling people on the lie of peaceful transitions to socialism. There isn't going to be one. Certainly not in the imperialist countries. Right. Bernardo Bender says, the monarchy took out Diana as well. A good documentary called Unlawful Killing by Keith Allen goes over it. Keith Allen? Is that in the comedian Keith Allen? I wasn't aware of that. Okay. Wasn't aware of that documentary, so it's I'll have to add it to my list. Tusker, hello to you. Catching up on 1.75 times. Well, hope my voice still sounds okay. Philbin says, Costa Rican Civil War of 1948, the Vanguard Party was suppressed following this strange post-war era conflict that resulted in Costa Rica abolishing the formal armed forces. Interesting. I'll have to follow up more with that. Lord Charfield, good evening to you. So, responses to the Chilean coup of 1973 by supposedly Marxist groups and intellectuals. You get the Ralph Miliband response, and for those of you who don't know, that's Ed and David's father. Ralph Miliband, of course, wrote some very interesting things, but his response to the Chilean coup was completely abysmal. He basically said that, well, the only thing Allende did wrong was dying. He, of course, was a reformist. He wrote a whole book called Parliamentary Socialism, which very, very effectively exposed the true nature of the Labour Party as not just reformist, but like ultra reformist party that's more committed to the bourgeois state and its preservation than they are anything else. And yet he was a product of it as well. So he had no critique to offer. He only critiqued people who said that Allende should have prepared the masses for a real struggle. And he responded to that by saying, well, you can't have civil war. And that's the thing with these bourgeois intellectuals. Like, they like to proclaim that they keep their hands clean, but then they love a martyr. That's why a lot of these people love Allende. They don't really love him for the fact that he was sincere and was, however flawed his ideas were, a heroic man who was very brave and was prepared to die for his beliefs, however mistaken they were. They love him because he's a loser. They love him because he's an ineffectual martyr. And they don't embrace revolutionaries who won. Because, again, to draw on Ash's point, there is no peaceful revolution. Revolutionaries who won are the ones who impose revolutionary violence upon their enemies. And that means, of course, the revolutionary period in the Soviet Union. It means the actions taken by Lenin and Felix Dzerzhinsky and Stalin. It means the suppression of the reactionaries by the Chinese revolutionaries in the period personified by Mao Zedong. And then, of course, the revolutionary processes that were successful in the DPRK in Cuba and elsewhere in suppressing the reactionaries, driving them out, confiscating their property, preventing them from accessing a mass audience via the media, exercising properly the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is the way in which you effectively fight a revolution. Bourgeois intellectuals, which is what Ralph Miliband really was, are people who are dedicated to preserving their own position within the halls of bourgeois academia. See our old friend Dr. Cornel West, who I see as appointed former keyboardist and former Hillary Clinton enthusiast, Peter Dow as his campaign manager. I can't wait to see where that goes. But returning to the bourgeois intelligentsia, they love to hold Allende up as a sort of secular martyr because they can mourn and weep and rend their clothing over the fate of popular unity all day, and the bourgeoisie don't care. You can proclaim that this is the way, and oh God, if only we'd been adopted cleverer tactics, if only we'd held more referendums or something, which is of course not the case. The bourgeoisie understands very clearly what the threat to them is and will act accordingly, as they did. And the other, of course, response, which stems also from similar origins, is, of course, the Nikos Poulantzas response, who went from being a Maoist to being a revisionist in about 2 years. And he ends up saying, well, what we need is to draw from the example of popular unity, and the example popular unity just shows us how we must broaden the base of the revolution by including all these petty bourgeois groupings within it, such as like petty bourgeois environmentalists. Essentially, what he does is he takes Marcuse's formulation about the fact that the working class is no longer the revolutionary agent, and broadens out the spectrum of revolutionary agents to include like feminist groups, but completely divorced from class, environmentalist groups, again completely divorced from class. It's this terrible selection of ideas which of course merges with Eurocommunism to produce the wretched collection of shite known as the left in the 1990s. This is where, by the way, people like the group that became Syriza came from. A split from the Euro-communist wing of the Greek Communist Party that ultimately became the sort of coalition of the radical left, which is another processes that went on in all the European countries. Only recently have the Danes finally re-merged into one communist party following this process, which was the elements of the old Euro-communist and revisionist parties split off and merged with environmentalists and Trotskyites and feminists and sort of postmodern oddballs of all kinds of varieties to form these new and completely ineffective and largely social democratic, or in many cases just openly sort of Tony Blair-like creations, which all, when they got into government, completely shafted the working class or just completely collapsed and imploded. And so that is the great legacy of Nikos Poulantzas' idea of broadening out the coalition and, of course, decentering or uncentering the working class. And doesn't that end well? And, of course, then you have the ideas of the Khrushchevite revisionists themselves and the Soviet Union, who just used it as another opportunity to further retreat from supporting revolutionary processes all the way around the world. And so the idea of doubling down on reformism was the main thing that the European communist parties took away from it, making themselves, or trying to make themselves, look even more harmless to the ruling classes. Famously, I believe it was Enrico Berlinguer of the Italian Communist Party who says that the bourgeois had nothing to fear from the Italian Communist Party coming into power, which of course meant that two things. One, that they had nothing to fear because the Italian Communist Party would never get into power, and B, if they did get into power, they'd do absolutely nothing. And C, to add to that, that in order to prove their complete harmlessness to Italian capitalism, they started proposing things that would ultimately lead to further attacks on the working class. See, all the conclusions that were drawn from the destruction of popular unity by the European communist parties in particular were all just leading in the direction of Euro-communism, further revisionism, and then ultimate collapse many years later. The further they got away from the need to counteract reactionary violence with revolutionary violence and the need to lead the working class to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, the further they got away from that, the more useless they got, the more the working class got alienated from them as they pursued endless petty bourgeois diversions into just complete dead ends, and then you ultimately get to the collapse of the late 80s, early 1990s. Right, so we've got more comments coming in. Philbin says, some organizing among military forces during the Vietnam era met mixed success. American Service Members Union and Movement for a People's Military, best examples. No draft for now, though, huge difference. Yeah, with no draft, it's harder to organize amongst the military because you have a dedicated hardcore of professionals. But on the other hand, with a much smaller army, it's less easy for the bourgeois to use that against you. Swings and roundabouts in some respects. Militia, kind of like Black Panther Party. Well, the armed self-defense of the proletariat is something that we will all have to look at some point. Because no matter how your revolutionary process shakes out, you're going to need some kind of armed defense that's independent of the bourgeois state. Again, the Venezuelan process proves that. Now, how that is organized is another question, which we can come to in an episode that will probably have to be encoded. But yes, the idea of armed self-defense is something that does need to be explored. There are examples, of course, of revolutionary movements who have done that effectively. South African Communist Party being one. The reactionists is from Mallard. The reactionaries and fascists always sink to new levels of depravity and perverse sadism. It's something to do with their psychology. It's rooted in the fact, the extreme level of violence that is carried out by the reactionaries is rooted in the fact that they have to use extreme terror to preserve the bourgeois in power. In order to do that, and especially where they need to crush a revolution in a brutal fashion, they need to not just kill people, but they need to kill people in vast numbers and with great sadism. It's a deliberately designed campaign of terror. And we know it's deliberately designed because the Nazi intelligence men like Gehlen and others wrote a lot of this shit down. Like, a lot of it isn't just random sadism. Some of it is, of course. The sadism of the upper classes let off the hook. The bourgeois let off the hook will all ultimately descend into the level of barbarity and sadism that is, of course, personified in the writings of the Marquis de Sade. But the design of like anti-communist terror campaigns isn't just designed to physically annihilate. It's designed to psychologically break your opponent by the imposition of not just the terror of death. An instantaneous death is one thing. A long, drawn-out, horrifying one is quite something else, especially if it can be imposed upon people that you care about, people close to you. And that, of course, is another level of terror that the bourgeoisie is more than capable of inflicting upon people. And so this is all carefully designed. Yes, it takes advantage of the sadistic tendencies in bourgeois military and intelligence men and lumpenized thugs, but it comes from a place of deliberate design. for a very specific political objective, which is to psychologically break your opponent en masse, as well as physically annihilating as many of their leaders as possible. You psychologically break them as a class. That's what they're attempting to do with this torture, with this mass reactionary brutality that they engage in. David Green, hello to you, says Costa Rica relies on its reputation for stability and order in order to continue to be a retirement destination for Americans of relatively modest means. Interesting point. President Jesus says, can't wait to see the Cornel West apologists try to spin that one, especially after they mocked Marianne Williamson for hiring that guy. Oh, so Dow went from Marianne Williamson to Cornel West. Wow. A man sure has principles. And to quote the Marx Brothers, and if you don't like them, he has others. Peter says, or asks, my insistent question is what is to be done to protect the working class revolutionary process, but how, in an era of brazen mass surveillance and uber punitive bourgeois criminology, it can work. Well, I've got a very good idea about that. Why don't I put that into the A Revolution in Britain episode, which I'm working on. If that's acceptable to you, Peter, just let me know in the comments. Philbin says, truth is, some of us Yanks just do what Comrade Bob Avakian advises us to do. He usually knows best, and he backs West, so I'll be pulling the lever for him in November. Well, again, American comrades, please correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't it true that Bob Avakian wrote or did an attempt at a book in like 1990 or something like that, which was all about how a protracted people's war could win in the United States? I'm sure I've seen that floating around in one of his many, many books that he's written. I think it might have been just before he sort of collapsed into being a parody of himself. Was it entitled like How We Win or something like that? I'm sure I saw this floating around years ago, and I did try and get hold of it, but you can't get hold of that in Britain. Maybe you can through internet means. But yeah, I'm sure Bob Avakian did war game out like a protracted people's war or something in the United States. It'd be fascinating to read it. Because Avakian is basically just a nut and a parody of himself now. But I don't think he always was. I think there was a time when like the Revolutionary Communist Party in the USA were a serious organization. And they were certainly taken seriously by the FBI because of the level of organization they had in the more militant unions in the early 70s. So they weren't always a joke, and Avakian wasn't always just a sort of egomaniacal nut job. He did at one point have something valuable to say, I'm sure. Philbin says, sounds like Bob. I know he self-exiled himself when he wasn't actually wanted for any outstanding crime. Self-exiling. Takes some money to do that. President Jesus says, the Avakian cult was just protesting here in LA on behalf of schools calling trans kids by their new names without notifying their parents. So that's their new gig. Wow. They should get together with the World Socialist website now. I mean, there's no real difference between them. They could make Avakian and fake doctor Eric Feigl Ding like joint leaders of their new organization. They can agree upon perpetual COVID lockdowns and also perpetual trans rights. Yeah, Avakian 24, yeah, maybe him. That would be a better option. Ash says, in the future it would be good to hear about military men who defect to the DPRK. There's been a few over the years. There was a number of American prisoners who stayed there, I think, after the Korean War. There's been a few who've defected over the years as well and who chose to stay there. So, yeah, that'll be an interesting one for the future. Right. Ben, my comrade from the CPGBML, says, sorry, late arriving. Was the Chilean coup compared to the Franco coup in 36, particularly RE predicting bourgeois violence in response to Reformist United Front challenge to bourgeois dictatorship? Yes, we did go into that a little bit. I mean, I think I would need to probably go back and cover the Spanish Civil War in its own episode. Back on the audio version of this program on the Patreon, there is a free episode series on from Trotskyism to Marxism, Leninism, where I covered some of this. But yeah, Spanish Civil War, basically, this, to reiterate the point, the commonality is the fact that this Popular Front type organization, Popular Front type government, is paralyzed because, of course, part of the reason is there's differing class forces within it. In the Spanish Republican government, you have the Spanish Socialist Party, PSOE, but you also have like radicals, liberals, constitutional Democrats, various others, and it's the reason why the military were able to take as many areas in mainland Spain as they did was largely because the government only agreed to call upon the workers to mobilize at the very last minute. And many workers, of course, did mobilize themselves, but the PSOE still had the dominant influence in the UGT union and was holding back and holding back and holding back, paralyzed by fear of losing their coalition with the radicals, with the liberals, and also not being able to hold together with the Basque and the Catalan nationalists. And it was that the working class was not mobilized in time in order to defend certain cities. But I can go into that in more detail if there's enthusiasm about doing a specific episode on the Spanish Civil War. We can get into that in the future. So, been going for an hour and 15. I think what I'll do is I'll pause it here. I'll bring this to a close for this evening. Been another interesting discussion. What I will do is I know there's another 9/11 to cover, so we'll talk about that on September the 12th. Funnily enough, because I do want to say certain things about the event itself, but more about what followed from it and how we can understand it in the context of the 30-year crisis that I've talked about before, that starts with the collapse of revisionism by 1991, and then, of course, coming up to the present day. So I've got several questions to take away from this one, including from Peter, and further inquiries, I believe, that were brought up by Banana Bender as well. So it only remains for me to say thank you to everybody who's tuned in tonight. So Banana Bender, Red Star Betty, Lavich, Jay, Mike, Roddy, Peter, Heidi, Morgan, Klavek, Frank, Alan, President Jesus, Burke, Irish Partisan, James Graham, Mike Hodgson, Movie Maker Joe, Philbin, Ash, Mallard, Shikamaru, Zuleika, and Tusker, Lord Charfield, David Green, Ben Kavanagh, and others. So, thank you to everybody, and of course Beiju. Thank you to everybody, and Pablo, of course. keep forgetting people. Thank you to everybody, and I will say good night for now. I'll be back again with you tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join 'em, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters.